We're really delighted to have LiaGhilardi here for our professional perspectives, talking to us about her work in cultural planning. Lia's a creative polymath based in London. She's the founder and director of Noema, a UK-based organisation working internationally to deliver place mapping and strategic cultural planning projects. Internationally recognised as a leader in the field of cultural urban development, she's worked for more than 20 years with civic leaders, urban designers, architects and arts organisations to provide creative and integrated solutions to the challenges of placemaking in contemporary cities. The most important thing, I think, really is to hear from Lia in her own words about some of this work, both in terms of projects and perhaps hopefully we'll hear a little bit about the way that Lia got into this work in the first place, the career trajectory that has led Lia to this position now.
Just to pick up from your introduction, Steve, just to give a bit of a background as to why we're here today and where we are in 2020. I started from a background of studying sociology in Italy at a time when the student movement was very, very active in the north of Italy. The University of Sociology was just, the department was just opened 2 or 3 years before I joined it. So it was a long time ago. And there was a very strong, within the department, there was Umberto Eco teaching, the semiologist. In any case, I got involved in the kind of urban movements that were happening at the time. Then I moved to Switzerland for a while, and there I was teaching immigrants literacy. But at the same time, I was studying semiotics at the University of Geneva with Noam Chomsky. So you can see the pattern there developing. The pattern was really looking again at cities from a semiotics perspective. And then later on, in the late 80s, I moved to London and did in the early 90s a master in arts criticism. And then later on again, I studied with Peter Hall, the urbanist. Again, I studied, again, cities, but from the point of view of creative and cultural milieus, i.e. why do we have periods in history when cities are the platform for milieus of artists, avant-gardes, etc. Why certain cities and not others? What are the preconditions, etc. Then I carried on developing the idea of creative thinking by going to short courses in Malta and studying creative thinking techniques, which now are widely used in business and management, etc. I use them for personal reasons, these techniques, sometimes when you have a problem solving, but I use them also with cities and communities when we engage in exercises of mapping. Then I developed my research and practice really starting in the 1990s, working around notions of the creative city. Now that is really very early for the creative city because we are used to hear about creative cities since the year 2000 when Richard Florida used the terminology first of all, but really we go back a long way, and it was really in the early 90s when we first started talking about the creative city in the UK. And then worked also with Charles Landry and Franco Bianchini on cultural planning. I started my consultancy in 1999, and then I worked since then on projects and as an expert for the EU, and then lectured in various universities in the UK and abroad. So what was my starting point? What am I talking about when I talk about cultural planning or planning culturally? It's just the first thing that struck me when I started looking into all these studies, etc., is that cities are not just machines. They are not just made. They are not just there to make revenue for living on. They are not just there to extract money from the people who live there, but they are really ecosystems. They are living organisms. They are also, in a way, they are a state of mind. If you think of Paris, the city of lights, You can think of Paris, Tour Eiffel, and all this kind of hard infrastructure, the architecture, the buildings, transport, and all the rest of it. But also that city is not just that. It is also this mindset. Naples is a city where fatalism dominates. So if you are to find a word for each city you can think of, it will be a word that is cultural in essence, that is psychological maybe, but it's also cultural. So it's not just, and that is to underline the fact that cities are not just this kind of machines, rational and all planned and all perfect. They are messy, they are chaotic, and they are cultural in essence. And this is also what Louis Mumford said in 1938. In the quote you see, they are works of art, he said. Mind takes form in the city, as we know also from other sociologists of the previous century, who talked about how the mind adapted to the city and vice versa. So the urban forms condition the mind as well. We know that kind of relationship. It's a dual relationship between space and the mind. So the city, for me, is a complex ecosystem of relations. And here is how I represent it in my mind. It's these components really that form the mesh of cities. The software and the hardware, the software being the people, the history, the layers of memories, etc., that take place in the city, and the hardware, the walls, the organizations that are there, place, etc., go together. You can see that, and I call that kind of mesh cultural and urban DNA, cultural DNA in particular. So my approach, and that of colleagues such as Franco Bianchini, Charles Landry, etc. But I say mine because I have been working with this approach for so many years now. It's really to try and develop places from within. So first of all, to take a people-centered approach to local development, and just saying we need to understand what goes on in that place, what the layers of history are, what the patterns of living are, what the rituals or what the many cultures that populate that place are, before we intervene, before we do anything. So it really is an approach that says development has to mobilize the distinctiveness of a place. It has to be based on that distinctiveness. It has to work with that distinctiveness in order to create opportunities for everybody, as Jane Jacobs said. So what are the challenges? Why did I develop this method in the first place? Because already in the early 90s, we were really beginning to see the first results of the sort of neoliberal approach to development and growth, not just in cities, but in the West, really. And already there in the early 90s, there were, in the UK, for example, there had been development since the 80s, the Liverpool docks, for example. And some of these approaches, I'm not just criticizing that particular approach, I'm just saying in general, because I had a kind of European perspective at the time. In many cities there was the idea that you could redevelop if only you mobilized cultural initiatives, big iconic buildings, big developments, etc. You could then regenerate the communities that lived in those places. And in principle, there is nothing wrong with providing amenities, with really doing up museums that express and that can help the local people grow and educate the people that live in there, etc. There's nothing wrong with having cultural development. But this kind of model of cultural development became a bit of an ideology, especially later on with the creative class and since the year 2000 with Richard Florida. So what was happening then, and at the time I was an evaluator also for the European Commission, going into places, looking at the investments the European Commission was doing in terms of urban regeneration, culture-led urban regeneration and cultural tourism and all these initiatives, culture-led. So I was like a czar on behalf of the European Union, going into places, evaluating, trying to see really the effects this investment was having. And many times what I noticed was like there were cities that were regenerated. So you would say tick, positive in a way, but then they slowly were becoming unaffordable for the people who used to live. I mean, we all know the question of gentrification, the question of displacement of people from their original neighborhoods. It's already stuff that Jane Jacobs was looking at in 1961. But here there was something more. There was a kind of systematic use of these policies by civic leaders, and in kind of in a grandiose way to kind of recycle their political careers in a way. But so among the many problems we had, it was like cultural production in itself was kind of dying out in some places. So you had the artists, the local institutions, organizations, etc., that because there was so much at the forefront, this idea of we have to be European capital of culture year 1990, let's say. So much focus on civic leaders and policymakers, etc., was put on that focus was detracting from the normal investment in really nourishing the existing cultural ecology, the existing communities that were enjoying that particular kind of culture. So it became also a process of not in my backyard. So having, for example, in places in London where you had edgy venues, where music was played, where innovation really happened in there, and the gentrifier saying, I don't want that in my backyard, it's too noisy, I've got to get up early and make money the following day. So really there was a lot of this going on, and still, and there still is to a certain extent. And then more recently, I think in starting from the year 2005, 2006, 7, 8 onwards, we had really this mass tourism, mass cultural tourism, which is amazing if you think of it. I don't know if it is like 45% of tourism is now cultural in nature, which means it's not just looking at an exhibition, a Picasso exhibition, say in Paris, and then a Picasso exhibition in Dubrovnik or something. It's not just that. It's also kind of all the rest that goes on in there. And it's the cities that really themselves market themselves. Dubrovnik is a case in point, using anything they had in order to become the kind of Game of Thrones capital of the world. And without thinking that if you have 5,000 people coming to the city center, which is a tiny city center where we only have 500 inhabitants, that city center is going to explode. It's not going to be able to sustain that over time. So we had problems such as this, and they are, I call them diseconomies. In the end, you fail to provide really the opportunities that originally you thought were going to come. The so-called trickle down didn't happen in many places, and on the contrary, we had this sort of diseconomies. So my task really has been from the beginning in looking at these effects to help cities to become genuinely more regenerative in a way, for real. And then very recently I started looking at and thinking about how, the climate crisis, etc., has brought it forward, and COVID too. But we know how extractive we have been of resources, of places as well, how many policies were about revenue, money coming in from gentrifiers, taxpayers, whatever, but not really thinking about how we would reinforce those, how we would really renew those resources we were using. For example, if you use heritage, a building that is derelict, and you turn that into a creative hub, which many cities have done successfully in some cases, but less successful in others. That building, if it fails to be used as a creative hub, it's wasted, because then it becomes once again derelict. Nobody knows what to do with it. Nobody has the courage to invent, recreate, generate fresh ideas, and the communities are left demoralized. So I think we really need to think in a way that is truly more regenerative and understand cities as systems of relations. Not just saying, if we just do one thing, I don't know, mobility, if we reinforce mobility, if we put up more trains, more planes going to that place, if Ryanair goes there, if EasyJet opens up another airport, then we will have more tourists coming, etc., etc. So it's not just one way thinking, but it's a holistic thing. It has to be holistic. Just like in nature now, with climate change, we are forced to think holistically. So and then we really need to start by understanding the unique texture of that place. What is that place really has? What is already happening in there? And then I'm arguing all the time that strategies, which I thought were the thing we should do. So I thought, if only we have a vision and then a nice strategy with an action plan and everything, then we will really make change happen. Well, that hasn't happened like that. So I think I've been for the past 7, 8, 10 years now moving more towards saying tactics are the way to do it. And I'll tell you in a minute. So tactics, what can there be? For example, mapping exercises. So what I'm trying to think here in this kind of diagnostic and engagement toolkit, because it's the two things really. So it's the quantitative and the qualitative. I have developed this idea that you need to look at different aspects of the local community and conduct different kinds of mapping and exercises. Most of them are qualitative in nature. For example, if you look at the distinctiveness of a place, you may want to look at the internal and external perceptions of a place. How do people internally perceive their lives in the cities? How do they feel about living there? And the external perceptions are also what the press is saying about that place, what the kind of brand is of that place, what feelings that place generates in outside, etc. Mental maps, people mental maps as well. In a neighborhood like Brixton here in South London, how do my neighbors feel about the shops next door, the park, the amenities? How do they feel about their children growing up here? How do they perceive violence, danger, or something? So, of course, I put in their desk research, because you got to know demographics. You got to find out, first of all, how that place works from a hardware point of view. The kind of tourism profiles and visitors, the local people, the spirit of place maps. Again, we were talking about cities earlier on, Naples are the fatalistic, the capital of fatalism. Why do I say it's interesting? It's also expedience in Naples. And I think it's important to capture that if you're doing policies for tourism or even just policies for local community development also. So the mapping exercises, in brief, really, I'm not going to go on for long, but I think they do a number of things. They kind of open the conversation within the local community about the interventions that are really needed or that they really want to be implemented in a particular place. So it opens up the conversation. Ideally, you want this kind of working across organizations, institutions, and departments and layers of government, local, regional, and national later on, but local and regional is particularly important. Also because I'm arguing that there should be more devolution of power to places and cities. I think that argument of devolution of power is going to come back again and again and again. And but we have seen recently with the debate about Manchester, about the kind of lockdown or not, and how the mayors reacted. It was very interesting at the time to see, you know, what if we had really complete devolution and real devolution, what would have happened in there? Where would the money come from, etc. So that's a fascinating thing. But also, mapping gives you a focus not just on the old idea of the creative city needs to happen here. So it's not just what needs to happen, but you know, the focus also is on what is already happening. Are there initiatives on the ground? Are there a bunch of artists already squatting empty buildings or something? Maybe they tell us something. They've got a story to tell us about what they need, what's going on in that neighborhood or something. So I think it's a shift of focus that you get through mapping, which is also on what is already happening, on how and where to intervene. Because often we have a blanket policy, as I was arguing earlier. Say you become city of culture in 2 or 3 years' time, all the focus is on that, and it's not on, you know, what the people are already doing here, what your institutions, your museums, your libraries are already doing. On the contrary, if you keep closing down libraries, then we have a problem also. What kind of city of culture are you going to have later on? So we need to understand how to intervene and where exactly. So we need a more granular approach to policy making. And so it brings new stakeholders to the table, etc., which means also that there is a big challenge to the established power, inevitably. So now that's an interesting scenario. So here is one way of looking at, you know, how once you conduct a mapping, you just connect resources to stakeholders, you learn from case studies, you may network with other cities that are doing similar things. You then implement, you know, your governance mechanisms on a good day, if it goes well. And then you bring all that out to policies, options. We started working on this, I and Charles Landry and Franco Bianchini, in the early 90s. Then in 1993, we developed this report with recommendations. And Mantua is a classic city, an Italian city, so full of tourists. It was amazing. And I made a joke here in the slide where I said, you know, there is a bubble that says, my feet hurt, where is the coach? Because literally, that was the kind of tourism. We call it in Italian, mordi e fuggi, grab and run, which was really, eat something, you know, while you're looking at all this Gonzaga history, etc., and then move on to Verona, Venice, and so totally extractive, you know, totally extractive of the resources, completely disengaged from the local communities, etc. So that was the situation when we went in. And guess what? The mayor, etc., said, do us a tourism plan, because the hotel people, the restaurants were fed up of having just these masses of people coming in for 2 or 3 hours, not spending money in the city really, and then leaving. So we told the kind of disorder and problems they had. So they wanted a tourist plan, and we said, well, wait a minute, why would you want a tourist plan before you understand what's going on here, really? Let's understand what's going on. So then the person who was in charge of the culture department, the media, etc., they started saying, why are these guys questioning our heritage? We are, you know, the cutest, the most beautiful, the most historical city in Italy, along with 3,000 more. I mean, our response was, yeah, what's so interesting in this city? Why would I come here? And they were saying, well, you come here because we have this palazzo, the other palazzo, it's unique. We have unique paintings. Totally agree, absolutely. And what else? I mean, they were not even considering the tourists themselves. The people were changing their needs, expectations, aspirations also in respect to tourism were changing, etc. So we started doing a mapping, literally. We said, what else is there? And we kind of, as a problem we put on the table, let's say, we said, imagine there has been an earthquake. It's possible in Italy and in other countries, and everything has been destroyed. You haven't got your palazzi, nothing. It's a desert. Of course, we know cities are never a desert. There is always something bubbling underground, as Calvino said. So what else would it be? What else have we got? And we started looking and mapping, etc. And then we discovered that there were many booksellers, people who had connections with the publishing worldwide. And this is a city of 50,000 inhabitants or less. So we had world-class stakeholders that were working in the publishing, and they had connections with writers all over the world, etc. So we said, hello. So this is an important resource. So we then established a connection with the Hay on Wye Festival here in the UK. We took the stakeholders on a study visit to Hay on Wye, and they were inspired. So they decided to go for a literature festival, which started, I think, in 1996, because it took us 3 years to convince the politicians, the media, etc., that you could eat with culture and art, not just with the heritage, because they were not convinced that literature and festivals were really the way to go. And deep down, we were a little bit skeptical about festivals, because you think, oh, there's so many people coming in all in 2 or 3 days, and then after that, what's the legacy? What's going on after that? So we knew that we had to devise recommendations, etc., that kept that festival alive throughout the year, which we did. So, but the festival is now considered a template. It's like the most successful literature festival in Italy, for sure. And then it's got many imitators, etc. But out of that came a lot of other initiatives, like 1,000 friends of the festival, who are community members, who are now skilled in driving, taking writers from the airport to the city, or opened up their gardens to talks and readings of books, etc. Learned foreign languages as a result of being in contact with the writers, etc. You can see the kind of positive actually development that happened in there out of this mapping. So I think that's a clear case in which mapping really helped.
In terms of developing that kind of richness that you talk about, is it simply a matter of time? Is it simply a matter of allowing people to occupy a place, or are there certain catalysts or certain ingredients that you can introduce to help develop perhaps newly regenerated quarters of cities to quickly develop the kind of vibrancy and edginess that you talk about?
Yes, it's an interesting question, because normally when I start a project, the project starts from a point of view of a city or a group of people living in a city, which are normally the head of departments for culture, or in other cases, community leaders themselves, who actually say, we have a challenge, we have a problem here. They didn't know how to organize their thinking in terms of what kind of cultural development, what vision did they have. Said, okay, we will do the cultural strategy, but we'll do an engaged cultural strategy. So how we could engage really the mayor, engage the key stakeholders, engage the community on what vision did they have for that city. Started talking about social legacy, cultural legacy, etc., together in one word. So we now have a vision which is for economic and social and cultural development. The process we set in motion with lots of tactics of, doing street art, occupying buildings that were derelict, former industrial buildings that were derelict, and transforming them now with state money into hubs, etc., of makers, where the local communities can go there and make things. So all these connections that we were talking about earlier have been mobilized.
A lot of the value, obviously, that you bring is that you are able to sort of come back to decision makers and say, hold on, we can't move without proper understanding of what's happening. And that's
Exactly. When you start this process, you think there is more to this city than what you claim there is. There is more to this city than a museum, a theater, interesting architecture and good shopping, etc. And there is more opportunities that this city offers than just the challenges and the problems that you guys have identified. So in the minute you say that, what I have to do is sit down and once again stand back and sort of design, really design design a process of engagement of the different stakeholders that I think could contribute to give us more vibrancy, contribute ideas, contribute prospects to the city. So we devised interviews. That's a number of interviews. So I do a list of people that could be interviewed. You look at what is happening already. Then you establish the stakeholders that in an ideal world you want to bring around the table. And you do that by acting as guide for interviews. And then you identify in the first instance the leaders in this community initiatives, or you bring them to you, you talk to them first and you say, how far this is going, how long have you been doing it, etc., etc. Can we have a meeting with the other people you're working with? So you keep opening up the discussion to more and more people, but in the first instance, it's like a set of interviews, really, which are maybe an hour and a half, and they are qualitative interviews. You just go and talk to them. You listen, you observe. Then you go to the places, you do some participant observation things. Maybe you go along to an event, and then you see how things are going. And then the people will come back to you and they say, okay, so when is the next meeting with the city? We want to suggest this or that to the mayor. Or look here, we are organizing a big street dinner or something. Why don't you come? Why doesn't the mayor ever come to these things? So you act as intermediary in all these discussions. Then you, in a way, as an external person, you got to be able to let go and let them do what they think is best. So in the first instance, is really acting as negotiator, intermediary, mediator. That gives you a lot of power, as you can imagine. And sometimes you feel, what's going on here? Or you feel like if like now with COVID, I cannot go there. So you feel like, what's going on? Will they still pursue that idea or not? And you feel like you lose control of the process yourself. So that's a bit of a battle internally with you in your profession, in your kind of, personal life as well. But then, it has to happen that the communities themselves, the head of departments also have to move and change their mindset. They have to meet up. How I'm going to bring all those voices that are coming back to us from the community, how I bring them to the table the next time we meet in a meaningful way. So tactics, yes, it's like all this listening, observing, participating, etc. And that I see that as the wealth of information, the wealth of vibrancy that comes to the table of the policymakers. It's really kind of to be aware of what a person is saying, because you can have in listening and in engaging, you can have the usual suspects, and you have the same people who for 20 years have been saying the same thing, that they want a bench in that park, and that park is obviously so awful as it is now, that one bench will not be enough. But so you got to be able to listen to them and include them into the discussion, but at the same time, you're gonna be able to inject confidence into those communities that haven't had it before. So you got to be really quite convincing in the way you put forward arguments and saying to those communities that are invisible and saying, hey guys, but yeah, I heard your mom cooks so well, or your granny cooks. So why doesn't she come and does something with us? Why don't we do a festival of different cuisines or something? So you have to keep constantly thinking about connections while you listen to what people tell you. Then you say, there is a connection. So there is an empty restaurant there. And this person is telling me that they're struggling with a small business or ethnic business or something. They're struggling with that. So why don't we put together with whoever the person is the owner? So you have to listen carefully, etc. Be able to be positive and inject energy into what the community is already doing, and being really, really confident that that is the right thing that they do, and help them really to develop that thinking, while at the same time making the connections they need to probably make in phase 2 of their project.
Do you think that the people that commission you to work with them on a, you know, a cultural strategy, do you think that they're prepared for the amount of questions that you ask and the amount of
No, they're never. They really think you do, just like, you know, we have manuals in the UK. We had for many years, since 1998, manuals of how to do a mapping or how to do a cultural strategy, which were very valuable, I have to say, because I think the UK was really piloted very interesting models of cultural strategies and etc. But yeah, no, they would want that thing. So why don't you stick to the museum, and why do you have to question why they're called in a certain way rather than others? So they don't expect that process of questioning,
yeah,
not critiquing, but questioning and adding ideas to what they could do
yeah,
instead, or maybe proposing alternatives that join up, say the museum with the theater with the schools, etc. You know how this works. But no, they're never prepared for that. That's also part of the job, is really to advocate for this method, to really show how they would get results, how many more opportunities they will create if they implement. I mean, the case of Mantua was really interesting because we were fresh then. We were coming, and the press crucified us. I mean, I was talking to Charles Landry recently, and we still have the press in all the cuttings, etc. of the press. You have no idea how demonized we were as Thatcherites, as people who really wanted to make money out of heritage and culture. Um, we were not, because we were simply questioning their way of doing things,
yeah,
which was really passive, like we are the guardians of the past. And we were saying, no, you have to activate the past, and it has to engage with whoever lives in that city. Otherwise, it's not going to work in the future for this city. So people defend their profession, their jobs. I mean, you can imagine, and the language is sometimes difficult to understand. But in a way, maybe it's better that I don't come from a specific profession doing this job, that I have such an interdisciplinary approach. That for me, I don't have a dog in the race. I don't have I'm not defending planning. I'm not defending planning.
yeah,
What I mean? All I want is really those cities to do well and for their people. I think really fundamentally, that is what I am deeply in the principle. Really, it's like you can't not just do well in the short term and invest a lot of public money. Particularly, I mean, I got a problem with this kind of city of culture things, but we don't go there, because a lot of public money is invested in that, and then we never know what the legacy is. We never really. Okay, you can't predict it, but yes, you can predict it if you work with the community.
I think your greatest power that you wield, Leah, is your ability to ask all the right questions or all the wrong questions at the right time.
Maybe it's that, I don't know. Anyway, so that's how it literally is. We have to hope for the best after after COVID, it is time for a reset.
Yeah.
And why not question these ideas of the creative city? There's nothing wrong with being creative as cities. You do have to be creative. Civic leaders need to have, but without devolution of power, how can you do that?
Yeah.
And, without money, how do you do that? Without really reaching out to you, how do you do a creative city these days? And what are the values of this creative city? I was reading Storper, Michael Storper, a geographer, American economist and geographer, and I really like when he talks about, he's a little bit, he's critiquing, Richard Florida, etc. He says, really, cities need to think about what they are good at, think, discover, think, rethink, look, observe, and look at where they are placed regionally as well. And dig deeper into their kind of industrial past, the skills they have had, etc. And then they need to set themselves on a path of constant respecialization. It's like, saying, you guys, if you guys in Mantua are good at books, then that is, you start from there. You re-specialize out of that. And God knows where you can go from that. It's not just books, publishing, etc. There is lots of other things that can come out of that. So, but the principle is look at where you are, what you have, look at your capacities, capabilities, skills, etc., and then go for it. It's not just a question of creating the conditions for a creative class to come and work in there. It's not just a question of the city as a playground, really. If only we could make such as facilities that attract the creatives from Birmingham down to London, or from London to Birmingham or something. It's not just that anymore, and it's never been probably like that.